Hello and welcome to the CADvanced Getting Started guide. In this video I'm going to take you through everything you need to know about setting up and using CADvanced from the admin area through to the dispatch area, and then we'll go in game and I'll show you some of the functionality in there. So what I've got here in front of me is a completely empty, completely new CAD. It's exactly as you'll get the CAD when you first sign up. So if we start from the very beginning for setting up the CAD, so let's do that now. So to log into the CAD, you use Steam. So that's very simply done by just clicking on the sign in through Steam. And then that takes me to the Steam page as you would expect. And then you sign in and then you return to the CAD and you're signed in. So if we move into the admin area, I can show you show you all of the admin sections and what they mean and what they do. So we'll go over to admin, and we've got a number of menus across the top. If we take those one by one from left to right, then I can make sure I cover everything. So if we start on the far left here with define values, this is where you specify values that will be used within the role play itself. So if you're a dispatcher, it'll define values that you get offered when you're creating calls or creating units, and if you're an officer, it'll define values that you get for things like arrests and charges and so on. So if we look at the menu here, we can see that we've got the different values grouped into sections. So if we start with calls, this is where you'll define values that relate to calls themselves. So to start with, you start with a couple of values which are required for the system and can't be removed. They can be renamed, but they can't be removed. So if we start on the left there with call grades, so these are the grades that you might assign a call, and you can see we've got a couple of default ones there. With any values that you define, you can edit them and you can delete them apart from the default ones. So if I define a call grade here, say grade 1, I mean obviously what you call these are entirely up to you and it will vary according to your community. So if I type grade 1 then press enter, that's created a new grade for me. I can rename it and I can delete it. So this is how you create values for the various aspects of the CAD. So if I create maybe grade 1, grade 2 and grade 3, we've now got a few grades defined. So if we then move on to call types, so again this will vary according to your community, but say I wanted a call type of a 999 call, and then maybe a 101 for non-emergency calls, and then so on with incident types. So this would be things like it might be an arson, or it might be attempted robbery. So you can see how these values, I mean these are just values that I'm putting in, but they could vary and probably will vary according to your community. So if we then move on to the next category, units, this is where you define unit types. So say perhaps a traffic unit, homicide, if I can spell that, there we go, homicide, and maybe a dog unit. And unit states. So we've got a default value there for officer emergency. We'll come on to what an officer emergency is and how you use it a bit later on. So let's create a few states. So I might have an active state, for example, and you can choose a color, and this will be reflected both within the CAD in the dispatch screen and in game as well. So if we choose say a green there, then we save that, and maybe an inactive state. We have a blue color for that perhaps, so let's save that. So you can see we've now got a few states for our units. So if we then move on to citizens, this is where you can define various options relating to citizens. So ethnicities, we might have white, we might have Asian, and so on. Genders, again, we might have a few there, and citizen markers. So the idea behind markers is that if you have something relating to a citizen that you want your officers to be alerted to when they search for a citizen in game, so for example if they have a history of carrying firearms or a history of violence, these are markers that will appear within the search results in game. So if I say history of violence, and maybe armed, perhaps. So let's move on to the next, which is weapons and vehicles. So it's fairly self-explanatory. So weapon types, maybe shotgun, pistol, and assault rifle. Weapon statuses, so you might have a stolen or perhaps modified. Vehicle models. Now, when you get your CAD, you'll be supplied with vehicle models that correspond with all the vehicles that are in FiveM. I don't have those here, just so I could demonstrate to you how you add vehicle models. So if the list that you're supplied with doesn't have sufficient, or you want to modify them, you can do that quite easily. So I might have a Ford Focus, perhaps, and so on. Vehicle markers. Now, these work in very similar ways to citizen markers. So I might perhaps have a stolen marker for this one, and so on. Moving on to the next category, legal. So these are values relating to citizen legal statuses. So a citizen can have various types of insurance. So insurance statuses would be the actual status of that insurance. So you might have valid, or you might have expired, and so on. Same with license status. So you might have valid again and expired. License types. So you might have a driver's license, weapons license, and so on. And charges is when a officer is assigning charges to a citizen. These are the options that they'll get to choose from. So for charges, you might have drunken, disorderly, and breach of the peace. Breach of the peace. So you can define those as you wish. Next is officers. So an officer has a rank, so this is where you define the ranks and the order of those ranks. So we might have a sergeant, a captain, and a constable. And you can see you can move these around according to the order that they should be ranked in. So that covers the define values section of the admin. Next is user management. This is where you can manage the users who are logged into your CAD. By default, when a user logs into a CAD, they don't have any permissions to do anything. I'll show you how to change that shortly. But once a user is logged in, then this is where you can modify them. So you can see you can assign their permissions here, and you can give them an alias. The alias will show up in the dispatch screen. So I'll go through the various permissions now and explain what each of them does. So the dispatcher, if a user has this permission, this gives them access to the dispatch screen in the CAD. Manage all citizens, well, that gives them access to the manage citizens option up here that we saw a short while ago. Manage call values. So there's a number of these different managing values permissions, and they control whether a user has access to these various categories that we covered a short while ago. So we've got manage call values, manage citizen values, manage legal values, officer values, unit values, and that's the various value permissions. We've got manage own citizens criminal records. So if a user is role playing as a citizen, this determines whether they can modify their own offences and so on. So you may have it that you don't want citizens to be able to remove offences and so on. So not having this permission would prevent them from doing that. Manage preferences. That determines whether they can access the preferences area of the admin screen. Manage users determines whether they can access this screen. Player. So if they have a player role, then that acts as a whitelisting feature. You'll see shortly as we move through the admin menus, you can whitelist your FiveM server. If you're using the FiveM integration, then if you turn on whitelisting, then only users who have the player role will be able to access that server. Role player citizen, fairly self-explanatory. If they have this, they can create and role play as a citizen, and similarly with officers, if they have this, then they can create and role play as officers. So then we move on to the preferences screen. So I said a short while ago that if a user logs into your CAD, they won't have any permissions. You can change that here. You can specify which permissions users who log into your CAD will have by default. You should be very careful when you assign this, because anyone with your CAD URL can log into it using Steam, and will automatically get given any permissions that you assign here. So if I want any new players who log into my CAD to be able to create and role play as citizens, I'd tick that, and then that would then happen. Next, we move on to FiveM integration. If you're using the FiveM integration, then this is where you determine how that would work. So you'd choose yes there. You'd enter the IP address of your FiveM server, the port of your FiveM server, and an API token. So the API token can be anything you want. You choose it, you specify it. It just has to be the same here and in the FiveM resource config, which I'll show you shortly. So it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you like. As long as it's the same here and in the config, then it will work fine. The panic button. So we can define here what happens when an officer creates a panic call. So we can say what unit types and what unit states will be assigned to that call. A unit has to have both the unit type specified here and the unit states to be assigned. So if I wanted traffic units that have an active state to be assigned, I would tick those boxes and then that would happen. And we've specified here that only units with the selected unit types and the selected unit states will be assigned. And here we can specify when an officer creates a panic call, whether we should set the state of all of their units to the panic state. Because officers can be assigned to multiple units, this determines whether all of the units that they're assigned to gets assigned to the panic state. The dispatcher area down here just determines, and you'll see this shortly in the dispatch screen, whether you get a user picker or not. There's two ways of selecting users in the dispatcher. You can either click on their little icon on the map, or if you've got the user picker enabled, then you've got a search box at the bottom and you can see all the users there. So that just determines whether that search box is displayed. So finally, we move on to the downloads area, and this is where you can download resources relating to the CAD. So you can download the FiveM resource, and you can download the latest version of the user manual. So that covers the admin area. So if we go up to the top right here, and we move on to the dispatcher screen. So this is the screen that a dispatcher will see, and this is where they can create calls, create units, and modify and delete them as well. We can see I've got a player in-game. We can see their little marker there. That's an officer. You will only ever see markers for officers in-game. I've gone ahead and created an officer and set them as my active player. So that's why he's appearing. I'll go on to how to create officers shortly. So if you're a dispatcher and you're in the dispatch screen, you can create calls by clicking on the little plus. So you'd add caller information. You choose things like call grade. These are the values that we defined in the admin. So it's a grade 1 999. We'd have a call description here. And you can see I can enter more descriptions, or I can delete the one there. Call incidents. So we can choose one or more incidents there. And locations, we can specify one or more locations for a call. So if I then save that, you can see the call has been created. Because a call location that you define when you're creating a call isn't very precise, it's generally just a road name or possibly a couple of road names, the system can't automatically know where the call is. So for that purpose, we've got a location marker. So you can place a location marker and then drag it to the exact location of the call. So if I place one now, the location marker will always appear in the same place initially. So I could zoom in and then drag it to where the actual call was. So that's call creation. I can then edit and delete as you would expect. So in units, I can define a unit. So let's have Alpha Bravo, and that is a homicide unit, and they're active. So I save that and then they appear, and I can obviously have as many units as I want. I can edit and delete, as you would expect. So that unit is created, but it's not assigned to any calls. But because we created that unit, they're now appearing over here in the call list. So I can assign that unit just by clicking it. So you can see that's been ticked there, and it's also in the assigned calls list for that unit. The unit is assigned a call, but that unit doesn't actually have any officers in it. So in order to assign an officer, I can either click on the marker here or down here. So if I click there, I can manage unit assignments, and I can assign them to Alpha Bravo with a rank of Sergeant. Save, and you can see that Alpha Bravo now has Steve Rogers assigned to it. So that's how a dispatcher would manage calls, units, and unit assignments. And obviously this map is interactive. You can zoom in and out, and that will enable you to very easily see where calls are and where officers are. And obviously as an officer moves around in game, then their marker would move as well. So that's the dispatcher screen. Let's move on next to My Citizens. So this is where, if you were role-playing as a citizen, this is where you would create that citizen and their various attributes. So if I click the plus, I can now start defining my citizen. So I'd give them a name first. I'd give them a gender, ethnicity, weight, height. I mean, a lot of these are fairly self-explanatory, but we'll go through them anyway. Okay, so once we've defined the basic parameters of the citizen, we click next to move on to any vehicles they might have. And this is where the vehicle models list that you created in the admin screen would come into play. So we'd give them a license plate, we'd choose a model. We've obviously only got one because I only defined one in the admin. We'd give it a colour, and we give it an insurance status, say that's valid. So we save, and if they've got more vehicles, you can define them there in the same way. But let's move on to next, which is weapons. This works in very much the same way. So weapon type is a shotgun, status is stolen. Save. Licenses, this is where we can define the various licenses that the citizen has. So they have a driver's license, which is valid, and they have a weapons license, which is expired. And obviously they can have as many as you want. Next, any warrants that the citizen might have. So you would enter, say, details of the warrant, and then save it. All of this information will appear within the MDT when an officer is searching for this citizen. Citizen markers, this is where we can specify which of the markers we specified earlier will actually be attached to this citizen. So we had history of violence was one of them. So we save that. And now we can create details of the citizen's legal record. So we can add an offence. So we'd have a date for the offence, say the 20th of the 9th, 2020, time 1854, location. So we save that, and now we can add things like arrests, charges and tickets for this offence. So if there was an arrest involved, then we can add details of the arrest. Automatically fills in the date and time. We can choose an arresting officer, Steve Rogers. We can choose some charges. So we defined some charges earlier in the admin area, so we can assign those now. So that saved that arrest details. If there perhaps wasn't an arrest but charges were still made, you can specify that here. So we might want a, I can't remember what other charges we specified, so we'll just choose junk and disorderly again, there. Or if the incident involves a ticket, you can add details of the ticket here, including the points, the fine, and so on. So say 5 points, fine was £50, notes, and the officer that issued the ticket, save. So now the citizen has the starts of a criminal record. I mean, you can add more offences by clicking add another offence. With a citizen, you can have an active citizen, so you can have a number of citizens defined, and then you can role play as one of those, and you select your active citizen by just clicking that check the toggle button there. And it works in exactly the same way with officers. So if we go into the officers screen now, officers are much simpler to define than citizens. You can see I've already got one. This is the officer that I'm actually actively playing as in game at the moment, Steve Rogers. So if I create another officer, I can save, and then I can change just by clicking the active character, and you can see at the top here I'm now role playing as Bob Mickelson, and I can switch back to Steve Rogers if I want. The little hammer shows that it's an officer. If it was a citizen I'd selected, then the icon would be different. So that's the main areas within the CAD. We also have a mini MDT within the CAD, which can be used if you're not actually in game. That can be accessed by clicking this little button up here. So what you can see we've got here is a mini version of the in-game MDT. So we can search for citizens. We can search for vehicles. So if I look up one of my citizens that we might want to search for, we've got one, Mike Citizen. So let's search for him. So if we search by first name, Mike Citizen, you can see he then appears. The marker that we assigned to him is there. And we can see all the details, all his details, his vehicles, his weapons, licenses, warrants, and the criminal record that we created earlier. We can also search for vehicles. So if I go over to there and search for red vehicles, we can see that Mike's red Ford Focus appears, and I could search for that. Similarly, by searching here, we get a drop-down list, Ford Focus, we get the same vehicle. So you can search for citizens and vehicles within the actual CAD. This is also possible within the MDT, but this is like a mini version of it that you can use within the CAD. So that covers the CAD, admin, officers, citizens, and dispatch. So now we're going to go in-game and see how this all comes together there. So there are quite a few options for configuring the MDT, and you start specifying those options by taking the sample config file here, mdt_config lua sample, and you rename it or you copy it to a file called mdt_config.lua. You just remove the .sample from the end. So what I'm going to do is take you through the config now, explain each of the options. So here we can see all the options that are offered for the config. So the first and most important one is the URL of your CAD. Here you would just fill the value for the URL of your CAD in there without the trailing slash at the end. That's very important. So you just copy and paste that from your browser and remove the slash at the end. When you open the MDT, you're given a welcome message, so you can specify what that welcome message says here. The API token, this goes back to the admin section in the preferences page. So this is where you can specify your API token. It can be anything you want. It can be as long or as short as you want, but the value you enter here has to match the value you entered in the admin preferences section on the CAD. Enable whitelist. Again, this goes back to the admin section. The CAD offers a whitelisting function which you can turn on by changing that false value you can see there to true. If that's enabled, then only players with the player role within the CAD can join your FiveM server. Sound volume, well, the MDT can make a number of sounds. It will make sounds when calls are modified or unit assignments are changed, or when an officer declares a panic and so on. So you can specify the volume there. It's a value between 0 and 1. The debug won't need to be used within everyday use. It's generally a troubleshooting thing, and if you're requested by technical support to enable that, then you would change that value from false to true. So now we've got a number of values relating to the panic functionality within the MDT. So an officer can create a panic call. They can declare a panic situation. That will create a call within the CAD, and it can also alert other officers of the panic situation. So we've got a default command there, which is /panic, and a default key binding, which is the default is F7, so you can change that to whatever you want. By default, the border of any officer's MDT will start flashing when a panic situation is declared, and it will also play a tone, so that can be enabled and disabled using these options. And the period of which the panic tone and the border flashing should occur for can be defined here in seconds. And also whether a declared panic should create a marker and a route for all units that are assigned to it. By default, that will happen. So any units that get assigned to that panic call will automatically have a marker and a route set for them. Next we move on to the terminal. So the terminal is like a mini MDT. It's designed to be turned on and left in perhaps one corner of the screen. It gives you updated information on your unit assignments, call statuses and so on. So the default command for that is /to, and also we've got default key bindings here. So the default is left, alt and 7. We're using 2 key bindings so you can have multiple keys to open the terminal. And similarly, to close the terminal, we've got a default command there and default key bindings. And as I mentioned, the terminal is designed to be open all the time, so you might want to move it to another part of the screen, and you can do that using this command here and these key bindings here. So if you're not role-playing as an officer, you're a citizen, and you're placing an emergency call with dispatch, the command you use to open the call functionality is /call by default. Obviously that can be changed, and with the key bindings there, the default key binding is left, alt and the right square bracket, but that can be changed. The call will dial a number. You can specify what that number is here. The default is for the UK, and it also has a couple of sounds associated with it. There's a ringing sound and a busy sound. The resource is supplied with UK and US sounds. So if I wanted US sounds to play there, I would just change that ringing _UK to US, and the same with busy as well. If you want additional sounds for your location, they must be in an OGG file format. They must be in the same location as the other files in the resource. And then you just change the value in here to point to the file name for those sounds. So that's the config for the MDT. Once that's set up, you can leave that alone and it'll just do its thing. So let's now go in game and see how you actually use the MDT. Okay, so here we are on the beach, and we're going to first look at the officer functionality. So the first officer, or the main officer tool, is the MDT. So by default that will be /MDT. And we can see we've got the welcome message there that we defined earlier. So if I go into the status screen first, because we've only got one unit, we're only getting the status for one unit so far. So what I can do is if I switch over to my CAD, I can define another unit. That could be, let's do something different, a dog unit, and they're inactive. Save. So if I now go over to the in-game, we can see we've now got the 2 units defined. I'm currently assigned to Alpha Bravo, and Alpha Bravo has a call assignment there. If that was to change, then that would instantly be updated within the game. So I can set my status of the unit by choosing the unit state here. We've got the values that we defined earlier, so maybe that would be, now maybe they're inactive now, so if I choose that, we can see that their status has changed. You'll also have heard that we got a notification sound there. That will happen whenever there is something of consequence that happens that affects your user. And we can leave a unit, so if we don't want to be in Alpha Bravo anymore, we can click leave, and then we're no longer in that unit. I can rejoin again as captain, so now I'm back in the unit. When a unit that you belong to has calls assigned to it, you're given the option of creating a waypoint and a route within the game. So if I click that, I've now got a waypoint defined. So if I go and look at my map, we can see we've got a waypoint there to that call. If I go back into the MDT and do that, as you might imagine, we've now got a route defined to that call. So that makes it very easy to instantly get a route to a call that you're assigned to. So we'll just remove that. So by default you'll see all the units that are defined within the dispatch screen. If you only want to see the units that you're assigned to, the toggle button up here will do that for you. So that shows you unit assignments and unit states and calls, and the main part of the MDT is the search. So let's search for a citizen. So we've got a citizen called Mike Citizen, I think. So if we just search for his surname, we can then see. So this works in a very similar way to the mini MDT that you saw within the CAD. So if we look at the top there, we can instantly see the marker that we gave this citizen, and we can add and remove markers like that. And we can see the details of the citizen here, including their vehicles. If that vehicle needs a marker, we can add it like that. Our weapons, licenses and so on. So very similar to what we saw in the CAD. We can add a new offence, or we can edit existing or delete existing offences. So if I edit this offence, we can see details of the arrest, charges and tickets. These are all the values that we entered when we were in the CAD. So we can modify those. And the same, if we want to add an offence, we do it in exactly the same way as we would in the CAD. So we'd enter a date. And then we enter details of the arrest date. And any charges, so drunk and disorderly, perhaps. So then that's then saved, and we can see that it's now appeared at the bottom of the incident list. So that's the way you search for citizens. You can search by first name, last name, date of birth, or their citizen ID. And similarly, you can search for vehicles. So if I search for red, we should find Mike's Ford Focus. There it is. And again, with markers, you can edit the markers for the vehicle or the owner of the vehicle here. So that's the main MDT searching functionality. The next functionality is the panic. So if an officer is in a panic situation, they can very easily just press the panic button here. And what that does is send a message to the CAD. It creates a panic call, and it notifies any other units who have been defined to be assigned to this panic call. So if we now go over to the CAD, we can see we've got an officer emergency call with a location marker for Mike's current location. And because I haven't selected any unit types that match our current units to be assigned, no assigned units are assigned to that at the moment. But if I had done using the admin preferences here, If I had an active traffic unit at the time, they would have been assigned to that call, but because I didn't, they weren't. So if I'd selected inactive dog, then they would have been, because I did have one of those. So that's where you define what units should be assigned to panic calls. So if I now switch back to the game, so that's the main MDT. As I mentioned earlier, there's also a terminal version of it, which is designed to be open all the time. So that the default key binding for that, or default command rather, is TO. So if I open that, we can see our current state is we're in Alpha Bravo and it's a panic call. So officer emergency panic. So that would be updated if I go into our CAD and change the assignments. So let's have a look. So Steve Rogers is currently in Alpha Bravo. So if we change Alpha Bravo's assignments, well, actually, let's change their state first to active. So now that will be reflected in game. You can see they're now showing as green. And if we assign them or deassign them from the call, you can see we've now got no assigned calls. So that's how the terminal works, and that can be moved if you use /MT. You can then grab the terminal and move it wherever you like, and then you just click the green button to stop moving it, and to close it, it's /TC. Finally, I'm just going to show you how the citizen call functionality works. So if I go over to because if I try and open that now by doing /call, you'll see I have to be a citizen to do that, so that won't work currently. So I need to go and change my active user to be a citizen. So we don't want an officer, we want a citizen. So if I go into Mike Citizen, I'm now Mike Citizen. So if I go back into the game and do call, I can now open the call screen. So this is where you're a citizen, you want to call the emergency services. This is where you do that. So if I do dial 999, that number's coming from the config that I showed you earlier. It dials 999 and we're getting a busy tone. Sometimes you'll get a busy tone, in which case you need to dial again, just to add a bit of realism to the scenario. And now it's ringing, and the number of times it rings varies as well. And then once it rings, then you can enter the details for the call. Okay, so now emergency services have picked up. So now we enter the caller information. So Mike Citizen, and maybe a number. The location. So we've got all the locations in game to choose from. So let's say Aguja Street, and notes on the call. Has had his wallet stolen. So once we've entered that information, we then submit the call. That's now been sent to the dispatch. So if we now switch over to the dispatch screen, we can see we've now got a citizen call here, and it's got the details, location, incident, so on, and it's automatically created a marker for that call at the citizen's location. So that's really it. That's covered all the various aspects of the CAD and the in-game integration as well. I hope you enjoy using the CAD and the FiveM resource. It's been designed to be as simple to use as possible. If you ever have any problems or you need technical support, then the best place to get that is in our Discord. You'll find a link to that in our video description. And yeah, thanks very much for watching.